Hello, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, good evening, maybe even. My name is Betsy Corcoran. I am the co-founder and a partner at Lede Labs. We're a consultancy that works on education technology and helps change things. Prior to that, I started EdSearch, which I still think of as the greatest publication for reading about education technology. And I am really happy to be here this morning my time, with Ben Nelson. Ben Nelson, you may know, founded Minerva, which has been one of the most interesting, one of the most innovative universities of our time. In fact, I'm not sure I can think of many other universities that have started in the last 10 years. And Ben, you've done that, which has been pretty remarkable. What we're going to be talking about this morning is the impact that all of this AI has on our society, on where we're going, in part because that's the approach that Minerva has been taking for a decade. Ben's going to give a few comments. I'm going to ask a few questions. Please do use the Q&A in the chat to put in your own questions, and we'll try to get as many of them as we can. And I have good news. We're going to stop probably about 10 minutes before the top of the hour and jump into lounges, and you can ask Ben your questions or even ask me a question if you have one. So with that, Ben, let me take it over to you. You're going to tell us, where is all of this going?
All right, Betsy, thank you. And I'll, of course, do my best, though I've said many times in the past, I dislike making predictions about the future, which seems a little bit odd for somebody who designed a university for the future. But in reality, what I tried to do was think about what should education be in a timeless perspective, in a perspective where technological innovation will certainly exceed what we're capable of, and what are the kinds of things that would allow us to thrive in that kind of environment. And so maybe just a little bit of context, at least how I view things and the impact of AI, and why I do think it's substantively different than technological innovations that have come in the past. And so if you look at the broad scope of technological innovation going back hundreds of thousands of years through today, you had roughly two types of innovations that have augmented human capacity. One was an augmentation, or initially it was the augmentation of our physical capacity. This goes from the basic sticks and stones all the way to the atomic bomb, and all of the things that were there in that process that allowed us to retreat more and more to value cognitive function. And then you had the informational elements of innovation, right? So from writing to the printing press to radio, television, the internet, of course. But that really presented us the ability to access information, to disseminate it more clearly. And it had, again, profound aspects for society. But for human beings, it didn't actually fundamentally change what was asked of us, what was required of us. We still could retreat to higher cognitive function, and now we just had access to more information. And that was great. It overwhelmingly improved lives, gave people access to resources they haven't had before, et cetera. I don't need to extol on the virtues of technological innovation. AI presents something fundamentally different, because AI produces work. So all of a sudden, those types of things that our brain wasn't done or wasn't really built for in the past, the technology complemented, for example, doing significant equations or a lot of calculations, where historically technology just purely augmented what we were doing. Now all of a sudden, it's potentially replacing what we're doing. So we have a new measure to think about and say, wait a second, AI can actually supplant fundamentally something that human beings have historically had to themselves. And what is it that we're going to need to do in that kind of world? And for me, that was particularly important to think about when I started Minerva 13 years ago, because I was relatively convinced, incorrectly, that accessible, personally usable AI was about a year away. And I was thinking about, oh, okay, so given, yeah, I was a little bit optimistic in that sense. But in but given that, I thought, what are the kinds of tools that we're going to need as humans to be able to thrive, not just in an AI world, but really in the world we already live in, but even more so given the coming prevalence of this kind of work product that's going to come forth. And for that, really, it was to be able to train the mind to get to solutions that were novel. So rather than looking at what is algorithmic, what is out there, it's not to say that you don't need to understand the algorithmic world, but how do you build on top of it? How do you actually think about different levels of abstraction beyond that? And so giving individuals not only the ability to understand and utilize formal systems or algorithmic systems, also have them understand deeply empirical systems. How do you actually look at the observed world and understand what it is that you can or cannot assume? What levels of information or hypotheses make sense or don't, with what level of confidence? Then how do you think about complex systems on top of that? And think about interaction effects and unintended consequences and second, third order effects, and all of the kinds of things that actually govern how our world works. And then how do you then take those ideas and abstract them in rhetorical systems and understanding how we communicate with one another and explain what it is that we've analyzed in that way and what we've created that is novel? And behind all of this was this idea of not taking what is presented at face value, to be able to break it down into its component parts, reconstitute it in various ways, think about the implications of that reconstitution, and then be able to deal with other people and work with them and communicate with them in order to make that a reality. And that, I believe, and I think there's significant evidence, is even more important in an age where work product is automatically generated. And I think that the implications for education and society of AI are incredibly profound when you think about it, perhaps from that lens, because we spend a little over $2 trillion a year as humanity in educating our citizens, our fellow humans, in a post-secondary educational environment. So not just forget all of the K through 12 implications, which are even more significant, but just $2 trillion in the post-secondary world. And effectively, much of what we spend that money on is not effective. We know it's not effective because we know that the measures in which education uses to assess students, when given to students, again, meaning not just at the point of the final exam, for example, but if you give that same final exam to the same students a year later, 6 months later, they will overwhelmingly flunk an exam that they passed because they haven't actually learned it. But what's worse is that AI is already passing it, right? And so we're effectively spending trillions of dollars a year getting human beings to be worse at something than the technology is already good at. Now, not to mention, it's going to get significantly better from here. And so we really have to shift our concept of what education is, right? And rather than create these systems where you measure, hey, can I recall information or even analyze information or produce work within a particular context, something that AI is going to be exceptionally good at with time, right? The real question is, can I take pieces of knowledge and apply them broadly? So when I encounter a situation I've never encountered before, when I'm doing something or where I'm trying to do something in a situation which I'm not familiar with, do I have the tools to be able to apply and analyze to that situation? And that's something that certainly a large language model AI is going to mightily struggle to do. And so for me, a reorientation of education to that not only differentiates humans from AI, not only enables humans to leverage AI in a better way as a tool, but far more importantly, allows us to deal with the reality of modern living, AI or not, in a much more sophisticated and effective way. And so for me, the introduction of ChatGPT, of accessible AI, is really an imperative for us to reform education. It's not that the imperative didn't exist before, it's just that AI exposes the urgent need to do it now. So that's my view at a high level.
Wow. You said a lot of provocative things in there. And again, I'll encourage folks who are listening in, jump into the chat, join the conversation. But what I heard you say that was so fascinating is you almost laid out the role of technology in three different eras. The era where it replaced muscle, the physical element, the era where it replaces, in a sense, rote learning or intellectual memorization, that sort of thing. As we move into this next world, what you suggested is that we need to get very good at analyzing, we need to get very good at integrating information, at applying information from different ways. What about the social dimensions of this? Because I could see an argument that says we replace muscle, we replace some cognition, we kind of flee or perhaps cling to the thing that is most human about us, which is the social dimension. Where does AI fit into the social dimension? Is that something we need to be working on? And then we'll go from there.
Yeah, it's a great question, Betsy. And I've heard quite a lot in kind of the popular parlance. Oh, AI is going to have us retreat into what makes us most human. It's our emotional connection. It's empathy. AI will never have empathy. That's what we're so great at. Let me enter into the exhibit A and B on that may counter that perspective. Exhibit A is that we as humans are actually really bad at empathy. All you need to do is look at discourse on social media. Look at all of the things that are really tearing our society apart on so many axes, domestically, globally, how we're unable to actually have rational conversations with one another. How, by the way, an introduction of AI in a different mode can polarize us so easily, right? And so we don't necessarily have great emotional intelligence muscles. Not to say that we can't develop them, but it's not like we're all walking around as master coaches and Zen humans that can work and empathize with others. We've got to do a lot of work to be able to hone that. Exhibit
But just
B,
to interrupt for a moment, Ben, are you suggesting that we're really good at the other skills that you mentioned? You said we need to be really good at integrating information, at rational argument. I'm not sure you can argue there's much more evidence that we're really good at rational arguments, any more so than perhaps at empathy.
That's very true. And I think one of the big differences is that cognitive processes that are a little bit more habit forming, that are a little bit more grounded in concept, that are built on top of it, that are generative, are things that we know how to teach, right? And so even though we're not born with them, we know how to create programs. At least we've developed methodologies to create programs that are able to teach those things. And that's also true for certain emotional intelligence element. So in many ways, it goes hand in hand. But at the same time, regulating emotion, right, is something which is quite crucial, right, in being able to do that. And I'm not saying that we cannot do that as human beings. Of course, we can, but it's not necessarily one of these things that we're just, oh, it comes natural to everyone and the AI will never beat us in that regard. And then you actually have to look at what AI can do. And we've all seen these news stories, I'm sure, of the AI girlfriend that tells somebody to do X, Y, or Z. And we've seen the movie Her and those implications. That is not necessarily that much of science fiction, right? It is not a particularly challenging thing to program an AI to be compassionate, to listen, to have good bedside manner.
Or at least to
Those,
do those things that look like
right,
that.
exactly.
Okay, so let's talk about our relationship with AI. We're seeing questions come up in the chat, and I'm going to smush two together, which is what are the skills that we need to maximize our use of AI in this new world? And are there ways that AI itself can help us really accelerate the development of those skills?
Yeah, those are both great questions. So I think first and foremost, the skills that you need to leverage AI fall into, I think, two broad buckets, right? Bucket number one are those things that are obvious, which is how do I actually manipulate and use the tool, right? So it's what we all talk about prompt engineering, if you're going to use prompts, or it's understanding the capacity of AI and then learning how to leverage it for whether you're doing coding or writing or collecting information or analyzing information, right? And how do you elicit the best kind of output from the tool? So that's one that's very technical and really is best done by practice, right? The second bucket, which I think is much, much harder and I think much more important, are those higher cognitive functions that enable you to evaluate what the AI gives you and then build on top of it.
Hmm.
Now, this may sound like, oh, okay, so I need to learn some basic understanding of being able to evaluate a fact versus a claim or a particular perspective, or okay, I get some information, I have to build on top of it. The amount of work that you have to do in order to get to real mastery level of that is vast. Because again, imagine that you are being presented with original work, right, that has a point of view that is based on potentially millions of pieces of information. And you've got to have both the foundational knowledge to be able to see if there are fallacies that are underlying the conclusions that are made, and assuming that you can't find any of those, right? Whether or not, once you understand if it makes sense, if it's likely or unlikely, what level of perspective, and then on top of that, to connect that work with the context that you're facing and thinking about novel ways in which that output applies to that context. So that means making connections and being able to transfer your knowledge from one area to another, being able to have original creative thinking on top of the creativity that the AI will produce for you. So that is a very deep and long process of training your mind to be able to get ready for that.
So in some ways, we need, taking that second part, we need to be able to ask questions of the AI around its fundamental assumptions, which probably means we need to know a fair amount about the world or about the environment that the AI is offering us some solutions around. So on the one hand, what you're suggesting is we need to know a lot. We can't simply turn to AI for an answer every time someone says, what's the longest river in the world? We have to have some fundamental sense of what it means to say, what's the longest river in the world? We have to be able to challenge the assumptions of the AI. And then we have to be able to go one step beyond the AI and try to take what it's offering and put it into new contexts. Boy, that seems like a lot of work. Now, how are we going to teach that?
Yeah, well, and that ultimately is how education has to be reformed. Because to that example, actually, it may sound like a trivial example, but it's actually a really important example that you gave, which is what is the longest river in the world? Now, if you just needed the name of it, and whatever, you can go to Wikipedia and you can look at lists of long rivers and double check the AI. That's relatively straightforward. But if the AI presents you with information, okay, what's the longest river in the world? And it's 100 miles long. You should be able to intuitively understand it can't be true,
Well, not it.
right? It's just too short of a span given your broad understanding of geography, of spatial understanding, etc. So there are other elements where you can trigger a level of sanity checking within the individual to see whether or not they understand that core element of claim evaluation, right? And those types of tools are really what education should focus on. It's not about, hey, let me teach you that the Amazon is longer than the Nile or the Nile is longer than the Amazon, right? It's about thinking through, okay, how do I look at the underlying claims? How do I quickly compare them with what I know to be true and make a judgment call that says, yep, that broadly makes sense. Let me just verify this outcome. Or, nope, that's fundamentally wrong. I have to go in and dig deeper or redirect if I'm going to try and get a useful piece of information, right? And so,
We're currently building our AI applications to sound very confident, right? In fact, they speak in the first person. That was a design choice. And they speak with great authority, great gravitas about what they are offering us. Should instead we be redesigning our AI tools to have them remind us to ask a question of the answer itself rather than to sound so bloody confident?
it's not a bad idea. I do think that it's important to train people to be skeptical of confidence to begin with, but it's not a bad idea to train people to say, hey, this analysis suggests this, right? That begs the question of, hey, do I have the tools to evaluate it, as opposed to having a certain certainty behind it.
Now, Ben, you've spent 10 years at Minerva trying to develop this kind of education, and you've done it in really interesting ways. You've encouraged people to go to existing high quality curriculum for things like, say, organic chemistry, and then you've put people in small discussion groups and really tried to drive leadership skills, conversational skills, and that sort of thing. I'm guessing that you've also learned some things over the last 12 years that haven't worked. What
Yeah.
didn't work?
Yeah, a bunch of stuff. One of the things that when we first designed Minerva, we were so focused on the cognitive tools that we thought content is completely irrelevant. The only thing that matters is highlighting which one of these cognitive tools, and we teach 80 of them now. We used to teach more than 100. That was too many. We had to combine and shrink them for a number of reasons. But when we teach these 80 habits of mind foundational concepts to our students, we said, okay, we'll just use whatever content best illustrates that particular cognitive tool. And what happened was our students were consuming far too much information to be able to ground themselves before they could get to the cognitive tool. And it was too much dissonance. And so instead, what we did was we started to look at what we refer to as big questions, right? And so thinking about the future of cities and oceans, thinking about and machines think, things in that realm. And we just used content areas to illustrate a cluster of these tools. And then we use those same tools in a different area. And the key is to recontextualize over and over again. And so to actually ground your learning in these content clusters is a really big factor. The second factor was that given that I was convinced that AI would be right around the corner, I thought that all of the tools that we have now and are being developed, the adaptive learning, the AI teaching tools, would all be available. So I thought, hey, you can go and learn your calculus and organic chemistry and everything else on your own because there's going to be some robot tutor that'll be able to answer all of your questions. Well and behold, that didn't show up. It didn't exist. And students had a really hard time just learning all of this stuff on their own, right? And so it became much harder for us to just outsource fully, even though we still mostly have students do their reading and absorb that information themselves. But now it's becoming much, much easier. So in some ways, it was a miscalculation of timing. The third, yeah, sorry.
No, go ahead. Give us one more,
No,
and then we're going to jump into some more questions.
And the third, which I think is really important, is incentives in learning. People respond to incentives. And when you provide incentives to do that work individually, when you provide incentives to actually know what it is that you've been able to do and learn, get assessed on it, when you provide incentives to transfer knowledge from one area to another, students respond. If you just say, hey, you really should know this, and then you're nice if you showed up prepared, most students don't do that. And so you have to really convince them together.
And what you shared is that Minerva sometimes awards Fs to students.
That's right. That's right. One of the most important incentive tools that exists.
I have a question from folks in the audience here. What innovative elements of Minerva do you think will be adopted first by traditional schools, and which ones do you think they'll be last on the list to adopt?
Yeah. So it actually is quite fascinating to me because when I started Minerva, I used to spend all of my time talking about curricular reform. And then I mentioned that in the university that I was starting, the students would live in 7 different countries and kind of travel and get immersed all over the world. And when I was talking about that, even though I spent 90% of my time talking about the curriculum and pedagogy, everybody was focused on the last 10%, right? They're like, oh my God, the students can live everywhere. This is amazing. Yeah, whatever, changing your curriculum, have you. And so given that, I thought, okay, well, though at our heart we wanted to see curricular reform, I thought most universities would start following us by doing these global rotation programs, and then only then actually adopt the curricular and pedagogical reforms. Well, it turns out that it's the exact opposite. So now we work with a dozen plus universities in 6 different countries, and all of whom have adopted at the very least this approach of taking an intellectual taxonomy, these cognitive tools, these habits of mind foundational concepts, and embedding them in the foundations of their classes. And so it was actually the curricular reform that they're doing first. Some of them have embraced fully the pedagogical innovations, right? Fully active learning, making sure the students are deeply engaged, etc. None of them have yet done a global rotation. And so it's quite interesting. At least I see that there is an understanding that durable skills need to be at the foundation of education. People don't know how to do that. But at the very least, I see that as the beginning of the reform element.
Alex Starlin, one of our hosts here, has asked a question as well, which is, he says, there's this dichotomy between the full embrace, Gen AI, and the caution in education. What do you think is going to be the poster child, or at least the first example that people really embrace that's going to effectively bridge that gap?
Again, that's calculating into the future. I can give you 2 hypotheses on what will be, I don't know about embraced, but what will get people's attention. I think one is what we've been talking about, right? Just this ability for students graduating from programs that provide foundation in systems thinking, right, to be able to thrive in an AI-powered world in ways that students that haven't had that outcome don't have access to. And so people see the results or they see outcomes of graduates from Minerva programs, or partner programs that we've managed, or people who've been inspired by what we do or what others do and have done something similar. And they will have a awakening saying, oh, wow, this is really interesting. I think an alternative is in some ways the contrapositive to that, which is, okay, now we're going to have a end-to-end AI offering that doesn't just get the equivalent of a B plus, E minus level work, but that is just crushing the outcomes that a traditional bachelor's program training students to do in a particular field. And that would bring to deep question, what are we doing? How are we actually spending all of this time and resources getting students to a point at the end point, forget organic chemistry and bio 101, but a full degree's worth of cognitive function? How is it that we're spending that kind of energy and resource on students that are just not producing the same quality product as AI? So I think that that's going to be potentially the big aha moment that is going to roil a lot of higher education.
Which kind of comes back to a question that I apologize if I mispronounce your name, is asking here as well, which is, so what then become the fundamental, the basic skills that students still need to learn in order to really make use, to get something out of AI tools?
Yeah, and I think that those largely break down into these core areas, right? How do you take a question and analyze it in formal ways, break it down into its component parts, proverbial critical thinking skills, where you evaluate claims and make decision trade-offs and be able to deal with that in its empirical, in a formal way. Then how do you then creatively come up with solutions that are novel, not that are just out there, right? How do you actually, often say that a good measure of a Minerva graduate is whether or not if they read 100 opinion columns, they will disagree with 95 of them, right? From all sides of the spectrum, right? Because the ideal approach is when you look at a particular argument, not that you think the opposite of what the person says, but where you look at particular components and say, yeah, these make sense, but these don't have nuance behind them, or these are too ideologically pure as opposed to practically correct, right? And so you have to have that ability to evaluate what you're presented with empirically and understand how it makes sense to manipulate ill-structured data, not something that you can look at formally. And then think about how those things wind up interacting with the systems in which you're going to implement that suggestion. So it's not only enough to be a critical thinker, it's not only enough to be a creative problem solver, you have to really understand what happens when those solutions interact with what exists in the rest of the world in fields that are unrelated, or you think are unrelated, but connect between systems, and what the dynamics of those are.
The classic economist slash anthropologist Jane Jacobs, who wrote Life and Death, Cities, many other texts, always argued that innovation came by taking ideas that were fundamental in one category and transposing them, applying them in new categories. In a world in which we are perhaps doubling down on personalized learning, on saying, well, really interested in helping you go deep on the thing that you really care about, do we actually risk making it harder to do just what you described, doing the Jane Jacobs idea of taking an idea and transplanting it violently sometimes from one area to another?
Enormously. Narrowness is a losing battle in this world. We know too much about too many things, be able to have profound change when you go narrow. In fact, almost all of the great innovations in academia come from the intersection of fields, right? If you think about economics, the big steps in economics that have come recently, it's behavioral economics, right? It is the marriage of psychology and economics. And even then, right, I think that's scratching the surface to have real profound understanding of the way that markets work, individual choices within markets. And so the key is that when you look at interdisciplinary education as it's been historically done, interdisciplinary education has just been degraded versions of disciplinary education, right? So basically, well, you're not going to really study political science, you're not really going to study economics, you're not really going to study philosophy, you're just going to study, one third of each, and we'll call it interdisciplinary. That's actually much worse than going deep in one area, because you don't actually learn anything, right? And so instead, what you need to do is you need to tease out principles and then show how those principles can apply to different areas. And so you actually wind up integrating knowledge across them, as opposed to doing 3 silos and hoping that somebody else is going to make the connection.
Do you see any edtech tools that are helping us do that?
Well, fortunately, much of education technology is in service of the education sector as it is today. At best, it takes what the education sector does today and disseminates it for more people, or makes it easier to approach, etc. I often lament the fact that just in San Francisco, there are 3 Airbnbs for dogs, yet there hasn't been a second Minerva in 12 years. Because there aren't a lot of organizations that start with the fundamental goal of reforming the enterprise of education, of basically taking the entire enterprise, going back down to first principles and asking, we don't really care what's being done. We want to understand what should be done. Because you say, oh, you need to learn calculus, right? And you've got to have Calc 1 and then Calc 2 and then Calc 3. We don't accept that.
It's always surprised to me, too, that with the huge number of edtech tools that we've developed, many that are around professional development for teachers who are already in the field, surprisingly few around that are specifically aimed at people who are learning to be teachers. I wonder whether you found it challenging, hard, complex to find the educators that you've relied on at Minerva, and if you see an opportunity either with AI or more broadly edtech generally to develop tools that are really for people who want to become the leaders, the guides, the educators, the teachers in this new.
Well, one of the reasons that we built Forum, which is the technology that we use, is that it was built for the purpose of delivering or enabling teachers to deliver a Minerva type curriculum. But even still, we need to train teachers on how to teach in Forum. Now, the reality is that training them on using the technology is the easiest part. It's less than a day and they can be up and running. The hard part is teaching them how to change their own instincts about what good pedagogy is like. That's because most of our experiences growing up in elementary school and middle school and high school and college, most of our experiences have been bad pedagogy. Even when we've experienced good pedagogy, we're so used to the bad one that we don't really understand the underlying principles. And so it's actually providing them that training. It's less to do with the technology, it's much more to do with changing their mental instincts and being able to then leverage the technology effectively. And I'm sure with AI and with new technologies that's going to get easier and easier to do, but you really have got to get them in that type of environment. And it takes a couple of years before it becomes more second nature. At least we've seen that with the instructors we've trained.
going to ask you a hard question because it's going to ask you to let go of what you currently do. But if you could imagine yourself starting Minerva 2, not just an outgrowth of Minerva, but a brand new, maybe we'll call it ISIS instead of Minerva, okay? But if you were starting a brand new university today, one that will open its doors in whatever it took you, 3 years time or something like that, 5 years, what would be different about that university?
Well, one of the things would be, I think that I would do very differently if I did it again. And of course, we're actually helping start new universities. So we have a little bit of elements of that. I would build a version that would be meant to scale at the beginning. So one of the things that we did with Minerva was we created what is effectively the ideal American liberal arts, high touch residential university, small classes, deep student experience, etc. So very high touch, lower cost than a traditional brick and mortar school, despite the fact that we're residential, but still not one that is hugely scalable because of the cost of housing, the cost of in-person programming, etc. One thing that I would definitely do if I was starting a university today and thinking about how do we do one for the future is to say, okay, let's create these same types of opportunities, but do so without the infrastructure, without the physical infrastructure, without the costs that are related to all in-person classes, etc. So I would, for example, have rather than 15 people in a class, I'd have 150 people in the class.
Okay, but I got to stop you right here because what you've sort of is I'd grow Minerva in a different way. But that's not actually the question I was asking. What I was saying is, knowing what you know about the world today, what would you fundamentally do differently, not just scaling, but organizationally, and thinking about the kind of way you're trying to train and educate students?
Yeah, and so maybe I could have been clear about that. The scale is not just taking the same thing you do and making it bigger. You actually have to change everything about it. You have to change the way that the curriculum is structured. You have to change the level of automated instruction that occurs. You have to change the nature of the way that information is being introduced. You can't just say, go read something, and if you don't get it, the professor will catch it during class. That's not possible. You actually have to make sure that the readings that students are doing and the exercises are all automated, and that they're getting evaluated on an automatic basis before they can walk into a much larger scale environment. Rather than thinking about, hey, you're going to go and live together, how do you actually bring students in connection and application of what they learned if they're proximate to one another as opposed to cohabiting, right? There are a lot of different elements that, at least that I would think about in a pretty different way, given where AI is today, but also given the need to serve a population at a much lower price point.
Could you imagine a school entirely based on AI?
Well, yes. All of its ambitions were to do roughly what a university does today. No, if the goal is to bring us above leverage the tool itself.
Great. We have just a couple of minutes, and then I think we're going to jump into the lounges. So I will encourage folks to find the lounge. I think Alex may come back in a minute and remind us how to do that. And Ben is going to be available until the top of the hour, as will I. Okay, I know you don't like predictions, Ben, but hey, I'm a journalist. We're going to ask you for a prediction. Right now, there are on the order of 4,000 universities around the United States, of which I think 1,500 of those or so are public universities, another 1,000 private universities, and so forth. How's the mix going to change in 10 years?
It's a very, very hard question. I think universities will continue to shrink in numbers. They've been shrinking over time, and I think that is going to continue. I think that in 10 years' time, universities will be more resilient than people think. And that is because the systems that are going to have to react are still going to be figuring things out. So for example, if you want to be a doctor, a lawyer, a dentist, a veterinarian, a nurse, you're number of licensed professions, there's an oligopoly. You've got to go to an accredited institution. You have no choice, right? And so it'll take those organizations at the other side, right? Or it'll take legislation, right? It'll say, you know what? You want to be an accountant? You don't need anything, right? You can just go and do some online course. They'll certify you'll do an eye scan, and bam, you can be an accountant.
Some
right?
companies wish that were true, but I'm
Right.
not sure investors do.
Right. So I think it's because of that many of these institutions will be able to scrape along. But 10 years from now, I think there's going to be a deep reckoning. And the institutions that are going to reform ahead of that reckoning are going to be sitting pretty. And those that don't are going to be looking at a precipice.
We absolutely know that technology changes both more slowly than we anticipate and yet more radically than we anticipate, per the comments that you made about thinking that AI was going to be ready in the future. What I've heard you say is, again, we've gone from an age of using tools to augment our muscles, to augment our brains, and now we're trying to build tools that will augment our ability to see connections, to see different ways of pulling the world together. It's exciting, terrifying, and overwhelmingly filled with opportunities and potential. So thank you so much, Ben. And we hope to see you in a lounge. Eric,
Thank you, Betsy.
Alex, if you're there, can you tell us how?
Terrific discussion, and I loved all the questions and discussion in the chat as well. So if we leave this session, go over to the lounge and search in the search bar at the top for either Betsy or Ben Nelson or Betsy Corcoran, and their table will pop right up. Take a seat and you can talk to them. The tables fit about 30 people, so it is a little bit of first come, first serve, but thank them both for giving us so much of their time and energy and incredible wisdom today. Thank you so much. Really interesting discussion. We'll jump out to that session. Meet us in there. Everyone else can also do one-on-one networking or talk to each other in any other way. And we'll see you in a few minutes for AI in 2040.
Okay, and how do I get there?